The evening air along the Jordan Valley carried the scent of wild grasses and the faint mineral tang of the river itself. The land here rolled gently, neither steep nor flat, marked by olive groves and patches of cultivated grain that spoke of careful stewardship over generations. To the east, the hills rose in gradual waves, their surfaces darkened by scrub and stone. To the west, the landscape opened toward the plains, where settlements dotted the trade routes and where the rhythm of commerce and agriculture had continued unbroken for as long as memory allowed. This was not a dramatic landscape. It did not command attention through grandeur or threat. It was simply a place where people lived, where they worked the soil, tended flocks, raised children, and measured their days by the movement of the sun and the turning of the seasons. The air in the late afternoon held a particular quality, a thickness that came with the approach of dusk, when the heat of the day began to release its grip, and the first coolness moved down from the high country. In one of the fields, 2 men were working. They moved with the practiced efficiency of those who had done the same labor for years, their bodies knowing the rhythm without conscious thought. One drove the wooden plow, guiding it through the furrows, while the oxen pulled steady and slow. The other walked behind, breaking the larger clods with a mattock, ensuring the soil was loose enough to receive seed when the time came. They did not speak much. There was no need. The work was familiar, the silence between them comfortable, born of shared labor and shared understanding. Their field was not large, but it was theirs, inherited from their fathers, worked by their hands, expected to sustain their families through the harvest and into the winter. The soil here was good, dark, and rich when turned, holding moisture well enough to support the barley and wheat that would be planted in the weeks to come. The men knew this land intimately. They knew where the ground was rocky, where it held water too long, where the yield would be strongest. They had planned their work carefully, dividing the field into sections, rotating crops, allowing portions to lie fallow so the earth could recover its strength. There was a rhythm to their existence that extended beyond the field itself. In the village nearby, their families waited. Wives prepared the evening meal, children tended smaller tasks. The elderly sat in doorways and watched the road. The community was small, perhaps 30 households, each one bound to the others by blood or marriage or the simple necessity of mutual survival. They traded labor during planting and harvest. They shared tools. They gathered for festivals and mourned together when death came. Their lives were woven into a single fabric, each thread supporting the others, each generation passing its knowledge and its burdens to the next. They believed in continuity, not as a philosophy, but as a fact of existence. The field would be plowed, the seed would be planted, the rains would come, the crop would grow, the harvest would be gathered. This had been true for their fathers and their fathers' fathers. It would be true for their sons. The rhythm was reliable as the sunrise, as dependable as the changing of the seasons. They did not question it because there was no reason to question it. The world worked in this way, and their place within it was clear, but they also lived with expectation. Not the anxious expectation of those who wait for disaster, but the quiet expectation of those who had been told that the order of things would one day be interrupted. The prophets had spoken of a time when the present age would end and a new one would begin, when the faithful would be gathered and the unfaithful left behind, when God himself would act, not through gradual change or natural process, but through direct and unmistakable intervention. These were not new teachings. They had been repeated in synagogues, discussed in homes, passed from teachers to students for generations. But the expectation had become familiar, woven into the fabric of daily life in a way that made it both urgent and distant. It was something that would happen, yes, but not necessarily today, not necessarily in this moment. The 2 men in the field did not speak of these things as they worked. Their focus was on the furrow, on the oxen, on the soil. But the knowledge was there, carried quietly in the back of their minds, shaping the way they understood their labor and their lives. They were not careless men. They attended the festivals. They observed the commandments. They provided for their families and fulfilled their obligations to the community. If the day of gathering came, they expected to be among those who would be taken, not through arrogance, but through the simple assumption that faithfulness was a matter of consistency, of maintaining the rhythm, of doing what had always been done. And then, without warning, the rhythm broke. The man guiding the plow felt the handles shift slightly in his grip. Not violently, but with a suddenness that made him look up. The oxen had stopped, standing perfectly still in the furrow, their heads lowered as if waiting for a command that had not been given. He turned to call to his companion, to ask why the work had paused, and found that his companion was gone. Not fled, not collapsed, simply gone. The mattock lay on the ground where it had been held moments before. The disturbed soil around it still bore the imprint of recent work. But the man who had been breaking the clods, who had been walking behind the plow, who had been present and solid and real just seconds earlier, was no longer there. The man at the plow stood motionless. His hands remained on the handles, his feet planted in the furrow, but his mind could not reconcile what his eyes were telling him. He turned fully, scanning the field in every direction. The landscape was empty. The afternoon light was unchanged. The oxen stood waiting, but his companion had vanished as completely as if he had never existed. He released the plow and moved to where his companion had been working. He bent down, touched the mattock, picked it up, set it down again. He walked the perimeter of the immediate area, searching for some explanation, some sign of departure, some disturbance in the grass or soil that would make sense of the absence. There was nothing. The field was as it had been, save for the fact that one man was now alone where two had been working. He called out, his voice cutting through the stillness. The sound carried across the field and dissipated into the surrounding landscape without echo or response. He called again, louder this time, and then a third time, the desperation beginning to creep into his tone. But the silence that followed each call was absolute. No answer came. No movement appeared in the distance. He was alone in the field, standing between furrows that had been plowed by two men but would be finished by none. The realization came slowly, not as a sudden clarity, but as a growing weight that settled over him like the cooling air of evening. He understood what had happened, though understanding brought no comfort. His companion had been taken, gathered, removed from the field in an instant, without transition, without farewell, without any of the markers that normally accompanied a departure. And he, standing just steps away, had been left behind. He did not collapse. He did not weep. He stood in the field as the light began to fade, the oxen patient beside him, the plow abandoned in its half-finished work. The plans they had made, the harvest they had anticipated, the continuation of labor that had seemed as certain as the turning of the earth, all of it had become meaningless. The rhythm was broken, and it would not resume. In the village, others were discovering the same absence. A woman grinding grain at the mill found herself alone, the second millstone turning empty. Her companion vanished between one rotation and the next. A child ran home to find a parent gone, the house unchanged, but suddenly hollow. An elder sitting in a doorway looked up to see a familiar face missing from the street, and no one could say where they had gone or when they had left. The community, which had functioned as a unified whole, was suddenly fractured, marked by absences that could not be explained or filled. There was confusion first, then denial, then a kind of quiet horror as the pattern became clear. Those who remained were not the ones who had been chosen. They were the ones left behind. And there was no appeal, no second opportunity, no way to undo what had been done. The gathering had occurred, swift and silent and absolute, and those who had been taken were beyond reach. The village did not descend into chaos. There was no violence, no looting, no breakdown of order in the way that might follow a plague or an invasion. Instead, there was a kind of paralysis. People moved through the motions of daily life, but the purpose had drained from their actions. Meals were prepared but eaten without appetite. Conversations started but trailed into silence. Work was begun but left unfinished. The rhythm that had sustained them was gone, and nothing had emerged to take its place. Days passed. The field where the two men had been working remained half-ploughed, the furrows uneven, the oxen returned to their pen. No one came to finish the work. The grain that had been ground at the mill sat in sacks, distributed without ceremony, consumed without celebration. The absences in the community were marked not by memorials, but by emptiness, by the spaces where people had stood, by the tasks they had performed, by the roles they had filled that now went unfulfilled. The man who had been left in the field did not speak of what he had witnessed. There was nothing to say that others had not already understood through their own losses. He continued to live, to eat, to sleep, to move through the hours as they came. But the expectation that had once shaped his understanding of the world was gone. The gathering had occurred, and he had not been gathered. The faithfulness he had assumed was sufficient had proven insufficient. The rhythm he had relied upon had been interrupted, and the interruption was permanent. The seasons continued to turn. The rains came when they were due. The crops that had been planted before the gathering grew and were harvested by hands that worked without the confidence they had once possessed. Life continued, because life always continues, but it continued in the shadow of what had been lost. The community endured, but it endured diminished, aware now of its own fragility, of the fact that the order of things could be undone in an instant, without warning, without mercy. The field where the man had stood lies quiet now, decades removed from the moment of separation. The furrows have long since been smoothed by wind and rain, the soil reclaimed by wild grasses and thorn bushes. No marker stands to commemorate what occurred there. No stone records the names of those who worked that day, or notes which one was taken and which one was left. The landscape has returned to its natural state, indifferent to the human drama that briefly unfolded upon it. But the weight of that moment remains, not in the soil or the stone, but in the permanence of the division it created. What was separated cannot be reunited. What was gathered cannot be returned. The intervention was complete, final, beyond appeal or reversal. And those who remained were left to carry the knowledge of their own insufficiency, to live in a world that continued, but that had been fundamentally altered by the absence of those who were no longer there.